Regular reminder that these sessions are being recorded. So it is a pleasure to start this session. Our two speakers today are Rachel Fraser, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford, and Jessica Bennett, a contributing editor for the New York Times and also faculty at NYU School of Journalism. And this session is going to bring together both theoretical and practical perspectives on narratives. And we will start with Rachel's presentation. So Rachel did her graduate work in philosophy at Oxford before spending 2 years as a junior research fellow in Cambridge. She won the 2021 Mark Sanders Prize in Epistemology and is currently on a British Academy Fellowship working on the epistemology of narratives. So we're really excited to hear Rachel's perspective on moral narratives and narratives more broadly today. So we will kick it over to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you so much for having me. So I'm just going to start off by sharing some slides and then take it from there. Okay, so the topic of my talk today is narrative understanding. And the talk is going to come in 3 sections. So in the first section of the talk, I'll introduce you to what we might think of as the puzzle of narrative intelligibility. In the second section of the talk, I'll zoom out from the question of narrative specifically and talk a little bit about a more general epistemological issue, in particular, the relationship between understanding and grasp. And in the third section of the talk, I'll sort of put the previous 2 sections of the talk together. So I'll show how the puzzle of narrative intelligibility and questions of understanding and grasp can be put together in a helpful and, I hope, illuminating fashion. So that's the plan. So now for the first section of the talk, the section where I introduce you to the question of narrative intelligibility. So let's start off with an intuitive data point. And that intuitive data point is that narratives make their events intelligible. So I'm not alone in thinking this. David Vellman writes, "A story does more than recount events. It recounts events in a way that renders them intelligible, thus conveying not just information, but also understanding." Similarly, Hutter writes, "Understanding is the outcome of our successful dealings with narratives." So the idea that Vellman and Hutter are getting at here is that narratives do more than simply present us with information. They also somehow weave that information together in a way that makes the events recounted in the narrative intelligible or comprehensible to us. They do more than simply transmit knowledge, they also transmit understanding. Okay, so if we take it for granted, and I will just be taking it for granted for the purposes of today's talk, that narratives, at least sometimes in the good case, as it were, do transmit understanding or render their events intelligible, there are a few different ways we might make sense of or give an account of the phenomenon of narrative intelligibility, this tendency of narratives to make their events intelligible. So one point of view you might take on the phenomenon of narrative intelligibility is what I call anti-exceptionalism. So anti-exceptionalists about narrative intelligibility endorse something like the following claim: the claim that there is nothing special about the way narratives confer intelligibility. So the anti-exceptionalist is happy to grant that narratives, at least sometimes in the good case, make their events intelligible. They just don't think there's anything epistemologically interesting about the way in which they do so. For the anti-exceptionalists, narratives make their events intelligible just by communicating explanatory information. So explanatory information might be information about causes. So I can render an event intelligible to you just by telling you information about what caused that event. Or I might make an event intelligible to you by explaining what intentions led somebody to perform a particular action. I can thereby make their actions intelligible to you. So the idea is that there's explanatory information, causal information perhaps, and explanatory information can be packaged in a narrative format, certainly, but the narrative format itself, says the anti-exceptionalist, isn't doing any genuine or important epistemic work. It is incidental that the explanatory information happens to be narratively encoded. The explanatory information could do all the same work, could render the events of the narrative intelligible by being encoded in a non-narrative format, as well as by being encoded in a narrative format. Okay, so that's the anti-exceptionalist position. The anti-exceptionalist position says, sure, narratives can make their events intelligible, but they do so just insofar as they present us with explanatory information. So just to make the anti-exceptionalist position a little bit more concrete, we can look at an example and what the anti-exceptionalist would say about this example. So here's a relatively simple little story. I'm calling it Gyges' story. Candales the king thought his wife the most beautiful woman in the world. He used to boast of his wife's beauty to his bodyguard Gyges. He was determined that Gyges would appreciate his wife's beauty as much as he did. And the king arranged, despite Gyges' protestations, for Gyges to watch the queen undress from behind her bedroom door. But the queen saw Gyges watching her. The next day she summoned Gyges and told him, either you must kill my husband who has shamed me, or you must die yourself. Gyges, when confronted with this choice, chose to live rather than die. He killed the king and took the queen for his wife and reigned for many years. So, at least to some extent, the Gyges story is capable of making some events intelligible. For example, it can make Gyges becoming king an intelligible event insofar as it presents us with a causal sequence of events which lead towards Gyges becoming king. But, says the anti-exceptionalist, the fact that this causal information is narratively encoded is incidental. We could get the same sort of intelligibility results from a causal map. So this is a kind of very, very simple causal map. The idea is that insofar as the narrative makes its events intelligible, it does so just by presenting information, which we could also just present in this simple causal map form, where, for example, we represent Gyges watching the queen undress, resulting in the ultimatum, for example. And the idea is that at least from the perspective of rendering the events encoded intelligible, the narrative and the causal map are on a par. So that's the anti-exceptionalist position. But of course, one needn't be an anti-exceptionalist. There is also the option of being an exceptionalist. And anti-exceptionalists simply deny what exceptionalists simply deny what anti-exceptionalists affirm. The exceptionalist says that there is something special about the way narratives confer intelligibility. So the majority of people who have endorsed the exceptionalist position are not just exceptionalists. They endorse a position that I call strong exceptionalism. So strong exceptionalism doesn't just say that there's something special about the way narratives confer intelligibility. They say there's something special about the way narratives confer intelligibility because narratives confer a special sui generis species of understanding. So Stuber, for example, defends the thesis that narrative understanding should be conceived as an autonomous and irreducible mode of comprehension. So for Stuber, this autonomous and irreducible mode of comprehension is tightly tied to a kind of first personal empathetic understanding of another's actions. And he thinks that other forms of other ways in which explanatory information can be presented aren't as capable of narrative, are not as capable as narrative is of inducing this kind of specifically narrative mode of comprehension that consists in kind of grasping the first personal perspective of another on their own actions. Another kind of strong exceptionalist position has been defended by David Bellman, who thinks that there's a specifically affective mode of understanding and that narratives are distinctively capable of allowing us to kind of affectively grasp a sequence of events. So I don't like exceptionalism, and I don't like anti-exceptionalism. I think anti-exceptionalism is not a very appealing claim, but I also am not particularly tempted by strong exceptionalism. So what I want to do is I want to sort of sketch a third option, a way of being an exceptionalist, a way of rejecting the anti-exceptionalist position without positing this kind of somewhat spooky sort of sui generis mode of understanding that gets tied to narrative. So the weak exceptionalist position says that there is something special about the way narratives confer intelligibility, but it's not that narratives engender this special sui generis mode of understanding. The mode of understanding that narratives engender is just garden variety, normal understanding, the kind of understanding we can acquire from all sorts of non-narrative sources. But nor is it that narratives present us with some sort of special kind of explanatory information. It's not that there's some kind of explanatory information that can only be narratively encoded. Rather, the idea is that narratives are epistemically special because they present information in an especially grasp-friendly format. So the idea is narratives are epistemically special, not because there's some special narrative mode of understanding, and not because there's some special kind of explanatory information that only narratives can communicate, but rather because ordinary information that could be encoded non-narratively becomes especially easy to grasp when it's narratively encoded. Okay, so at this point, we're going to need to dig a little bit into the notion of grasp. So the kind of weak exceptionalism I'm interested in defending says, look, what's special about narratives is that they present information in a grasp-friendly format. But at this point, we don't have the background required to understand what's going on when I talk about a grasp-friendly format. So we're going to need to switch gear a little bit and talk a bit about what grasp is, why grasp matters. And to do this, we need to just do a little bit of epistemology. So here are some fairly standard epistemological assumptions that are going to help you make sense of why this question of grasp is important. So it's generally assumed in epistemology that knowing why P is not sufficient for understanding why P. So the idea is that understanding is a kind of richer and higher cognitive accomplishment than mere knowledge. So Pritchard is just one of many people who has defended this idea, but he has this really helpful example, I think, that motivates the idea that knowledge is not sufficient for understanding. So he imagines in a sort of cheerful scenario, the sort of cheerful scenario that philosophers love, he asks us to imagine that our house has burnt down. And suppose that we receive some sort of explanation of why our house has burnt down. Suppose that our house has burnt down because of faulty wiring. And suppose our distressed child asks us why the house has burnt down. And we tell the child the house burnt down because of faulty wiring. Pritchard's claim is that a child can come to know why the house burnt down on the basis of this testimony. A child can come to know that the house burnt down because of faulty wiring, but that this knowledge is not sufficient for the child to count as really understanding why the house burnt down. They don't have enough of a grip, enough of a grasp of the explanation to count as genuinely understanding why the house burnt down. So grasp gets introduced by epistemologists kind of as a term of art, where grasp picks out this special privileged cognitive relation in which an agent must stand to an explanation in order for that explanation to furnish her with understanding. So the idea is that an adult or a firefighter might grasp an explanation of why a house burnt down and thus understand why a house burnt down. But if they articulate this understanding, if they tell a child this explanation, the child is not thereby going to come to understand, because the child is not going to properly grasp the explanation which the firefighter or the adult has provided. So this, I think, is nice because it brings out one of the reasons why epistemologists might be particularly interested in narrative. Because what this example brings out is that there's an important difference between knowledge and understanding. It's not just that understanding is a sort of higher grade of cognitive achievement than knowledge. It's that understanding is much harder to transmit via testimony than knowledge. Most epistemologists think that knowledge is relatively easy to testimonially transmit, but that understanding is much, much harder to testimonially transmit. So one of the reasons you might be interested in narratives, and one of the reasons I am interested in narratives as an epistemologist, is that it seems like narratives, because they have this capacity to make their events intelligible, narratives might be a way of transmitting understanding. And that's something that's hard to do. It's much harder to transmit understanding than it is to transmit knowledge. So narratives look to have this really epistemologically special quality, because they can transmit, or at least have the potential to transmit, this kind of higher grade cognitive achievement that other more modest forms of testimony don't have the capacity to transmit. Okay, so that's grasp and its relation with understanding. So what exactly is grasp, right? Grasp gets introduced as this term of art. We say, well, grasp is the cognitive relation you have to stand into an explanation in order to count as understanding. But what exactly is that cognitive relation? Unsurprisingly, philosophers disagree a lot about this. But one very prominent, I think it's probably the most widely accepted view of grasp, says that to grasp an explanation, you need a sufficiently rich mental representation of the explanation. And you need to be able to fluently manipulate that mental representation. So someone who understands YP rather than merely knowing YP, because of this rich mental representation, which they can fluently manipulate, they're going to be able to do things like give explanations for YP in their own words and answer questions about, how things would have turned out had things been different in some way. They're going to be able to answer what if things had been different questions, because they have this rich mental representation which they can fluently manipulate. Someone who merely knows YP, just knows an explanation, isn't necessarily going to be able to manipulate their mental representation of the explanation in such a way as to give them these abilities, these important cognitive abilities of giving explanations or answering what if things had been different questions. So this allows us to get a better sense of what the weak exceptionalist claim actually amounts to. I started off with this claim that there is something special about the way narratives confer intelligibility. They present information in a grasp-friendly format. We can now see in a bit more detail what exactly that means. What it means is that narratives present information so as to facilitate rich, manipulable representations of the target events. Okay. So that's weak exceptionalism. It's clearly an alternative to, anti-exceptionalism on the one hand and strong exceptionalism on the other. Why think that weak exceptionalism is true? Clearly, I'm not going to be able to, persuade you of weak exceptionalism in 5 or so minutes, but I hope I can sort of give you at least some sense of why weak exceptionalism might be an appealing claim. So what I'm going to do in this final section of the talk is sketch an account of why weak exceptionalism might be true. Okay, so the first thing to notice is that the crucial idea behind weak exceptionalism is the following idea. The idea that how information is formatted can affect its cognitive profile. So one really simple example to get a feel for why this might be so is to consider the difference between an English to Spanish dictionary and a Spanish to English dictionary. So an English to Spanish dictionary and a Spanish to English dictionary are going to, if they're any good, contain all the same information. But an English to Spanish dictionary is going to be really helpful for me, and a Spanish to English dictionary is going to be much, much, much less helpful. So we've got the same information formatted in 2 different ways. And I'm going to be able to make much more use of an English to Spanish dictionary than a Spanish to English dictionary. Another example that I like is imagine I'm trying to remember all the things that are in my bag. One way I might encode this information, the information about what's in my bag, is via an unstructured list. Another way I might encode this information is by imposing hierarchical structure upon the information. So here's a representation of what that hierarchical structure might look like. So if I want to remember what's in my bag, the way of formatting the information that imposes hierarchical structure is going to be a far better way of remembering the information than simply trying to remember the unstructured list. Hierarchical structure imposed on information facilitates recall. So the way in which I've structured my information affects its cognitive profile by making the information easier to recall. So that's a kind of very high level claim, right? That how information is formatted can make a difference to its cognitive profile. That's clearly insufficient to show that weak exceptionalism is true, but it's a kind of high level proof of concept. So now let's turn to some of the details of my weak exceptionalist picture. So you'll recall that the picture of grasp I'm working with is an account of grasp on what it is to grasp an explanation, is to possess a rich, manipulable representation of the target system. It's to be able to, it's to have certain cognitive abilities with respect to the explanation. And here's a general fact about abilities. Abilities can be scaffolded. So what do I mean when I say abilities can be scaffolded? Well, here are some examples. We can scaffold the ability to ride a bike by putting stabilizers on it. And we can scaffold my ability to work in a cafe by giving me noise cancelling headphones. So stabilizers and noise cancelling headphones can scaffold abilities because they can yield abilities in an agent where abilities were not before present. And abilities in general can be scaffolded, but cognitive abilities also can be scaffolded. So here is a good example of cognitive scaffolding. Suppose that a teacher has just taught her class Pythagoras' theorem. We can imagine there are really bright students and some students who are also smart, but need a little bit of extra help. So she gives the more able students puzzle 1, right? And you can use Pythagoras' theorem to solve puzzle 1, but it's kind of a non-trivial matter to figure out that you can solve puzzle 1 using Pythagoras' theorem. So the really able students are given puzzle 1 and they on their own figure out, oh, right, I can use Pythagoras' theorem to solve this problem. The students who need a bit more help are given a variant of puzzle 1 on which it's made more obvious to them that Pythagoras' theorem is a way to answer the question. Like the way in which the problem is presented to them makes salient the fact that Pythagoras' theorem can be used as a way to solve this problem. So what the teacher is doing, I think here, is she is modeling the puzzle for the weaker students and thus scaffolding the weaker students' abilities. So we model a target when we represent the target so as to make it clear what sorts of background knowledge or abilities are appropriately brought to bear on that target. So the idea here is that the weaker students would not on their own have been able to solve the puzzle because they wouldn't have been able to figure out without the kind of coaxing or hints that the teacher gave them that Pythagoras' theorem was the bit of background knowledge that they needed to bring to bear on the puzzle. So the teacher scaffolds their cognitive abilities by modeling the puzzle in a particular way. So that's my example of how cognitive abilities can be scaffolded by modeling. So my idea is that we can think of narratives in this fashion. Narratives scaffold cognitive abilities by modeling their events. Narratives present their events in ways that make it clear to an audience which bits of background knowledge should be brought to bear in thinking about those events. And they model the events that they describe in a way that makes it salient to hearers which bits of background knowledge are relevant to thinking about those events. And so the model scaffolds the kinds of cognitive abilities that are required for grasp. Grasp, of course, you'll recall, being the cognitive relation that an agent must stand into an explanation to count as understanding rather than merely sort of knowing that explanation. So we have the following picture. Narratives model events, and the models scaffold cognitive abilities. By scaffolding cognitive abilities, narratives allow the hearers of narratives to grasp the explanatory information that narratives presents, rather than merely coming to know the narrative, the explanatory information that narratives presents. So just to quickly sum up, where does this leave us? It leaves us with the following picture. There is a viable alternative to exceptionalism and anti-exceptionalism. We're not stuck with thinking either there's nothing epistemologically special about the way narratives confer intelligibility and appealing to these spooky and I think very undermotivated sort of sui generis species of understanding. We can instead be weak exceptionalists. We can think that narratives are epistemologically special, not because they provide some special species of understanding or because they convey some special kind of information, but rather because they format information in such a way as to scaffold the kinds of cognitive abilities that are constitutive of understanding. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really excellent. I think we'll have time for maybe one question from the audience. Before we get to that, yeah, we will have questions. I was wondering if you could quickly trace a line for those who are unfamiliar with your earlier work on narrative testimony. Trace a line between earlier arguments you've made about how audiences are very epistemically dependent on narrators, and this new work, which I think makes that argument even more clear, but I would just love to hear in your own words, and for our audience, like what that connection is.
Of course, very happy to do that. So the work I've done previously on narrative started off as a kind of unease on my part with the epistemology of testimony. So I at least started writing my doctoral thesis on the epistemology of testimony. So epistemology of testimony is this field within epistemology where the basic question is something like, hey, it turns out that lots of the stuff we know just on the basis of other people's say-so. So examples of this are really easy to come up with. Testimonially based knowledge is completely pervasive. So knowledge of, for example, what time my train will leave tomorrow. That's testimonially based belief because I'm relying on a timetable to figure out when I should arrive at the station. You can probably come up with a whole bunch of examples for yourself. So the epistemology of testimony standardly asks the following, asks questions about what I call simple testimony. So simple testimony is what one speaker offers to another when they testify by way of a single simple assertoric sentence. So something like, your train leaves from platform 3 would be an example, or no, there is no onion in this soup would be another example. So that's a completely fine question to ask, right? It's very valuable to understand the kind of epistemological dynamics of simple testimony. But once you start thinking about it, it's extremely striking that a very small fragment of our epistemological lives are taken up in the offering of simple testimony. Lots of our testimony is narratively structured. It, has a kind of narrative arc. If you ask someone how their day went, they're not, well, maybe they'll just say my day was fine, but often they'll give you a little mini story about how their day went. So my thought was, it seems like the kinds of epistemological dependence that speaker and hearer kind of enter into when it comes to narrative testimony, it seems like it's a richer and deeper kind of epistemic dependence than in cases where you're merely offered simple testimony. Because the idea is something like this. What goes on in a narrative? In a narrative, I'm not just giving you information, I'm also structuring that information for you. So what happens in simple testimony is you give me a bit of information and I have to decide whether to take that information in or reject it. That's obviously an oversimplification, but that's the basic structure of the problem. Accept or reject the information. When it comes to narrative testimony, there are two things going on. There's information, and you have to decide whether to accept or reject that information, but there's also that information is structured in a particular way. So there are sort of two questions, right? One question is, should I accept or reject this information? And another question is, should I accept or reject this structuring of the information? And when you allow someone to structure information for you, because the way information is structured affects its cognitive profile, you're allowing someone to have these really quite significant, you're giving someone a lot of epistemological power, right? Because you're allowing somebody to determine what kinds of purposes you're going to be able to readily put your information to, for example. And a lot of these effects are extremely subtle, very difficult to unpick. It's also extremely difficult to separate out information from the way it's structured in many cases, at least for practical purposes. So that's the sort of rough idea, is that narrative testimony engenders this much deeper form of epistemological dependence than simple testimony does. And it's a form of dependence that epistemologists of testimony just haven't wrestled with thus far, because they've been focusing on these cases of simple testimony. So how my project in this paper, that my work in progress relates, is I guess I'm trying to figure out sort of what we should make, basically, what we should make of this sort of richer, deeper form of epistemological dependence. Because one way to go would just be to be sort of extremely prim about things and say, oh, well, we should never give someone that kind of epistemological power over us. We should always determine for ourselves how to structure information. There are various worries you might have about that. You might think that the kind of ideal of autonomy being appealed to is a silly one, or you might just think it's impractical. But you might also just think that actually there are tremendous benefits sometimes to allowing somebody else to structure information for you. And this paper is an attempt to figure out what one of those benefits might be. So the idea is that narratives actually have this tremendous epistemological potency. Their capacity, their much remarked on capacity to make events intelligible, comes from the fact that narratives are a way of structuring information. And so when somebody structures information for you, that can sort of give you, scaffold certain cognitive abilities that you would not have if it were sort of left up to you to structure the information for yourself. So you can kind of think of it as an attempt to figure out or trace some of the implications, the sort of broader epistemological implications of the richer form of epistemological dependence that I started theorizing in the narrative testimony paper.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That is so helpful and a really just perfect setup for our second speaker, Jessica Bennett, who, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a journalist, a contributing editor for the New York Times, and also faculty at NYU School of Journalism. We're so lucky to have Jessica with us here today. She has won many awards and has really focused on gender, social issues, and culture. She's the author of 2 best-selling books and just has so much rich and important experience on this question about really the responsibility that practitioners of narratives have for structuring information about the world in ways that are graspable. And so, Jessica, just to start, I would love to hear more about sort of maybe a little brief intro on how you got into journalism and also how you think about teaching journalism, because the questions that Rachel raised during her talk seem to me to be just so central and relevant to the practice of storytelling in the public sphere.
Yeah, for sure. It's so great to be here. That's funny. I was thinking about that during Rachel's talk, that you all should come speak to my class because this is such a fascinating question. And it's also something that as a journalist or as a practitioner, I don't really think about. Like I have been trained to do the thing, not to think about the thing. So to actually take a step back and think about how we create narratives and the stickiness of them and how you create a sticky narrative is super fascinating. And with teaching, so to give a little bit of my backstory, I always knew I wanted to be a journalist. I loved talking to strangers and telling their stories. I was a good writer, so it was kind of like a natural arc for me. And I started my career at Newsweek magazine, and kind of worked my way up. I was a general assignment reporter. I was willing to cover anything. It was later on, as I rose up my career, that gender and women's issues really became my focus. And so eventually I wrote this book, and I ended up pitching the New York Times on a position covering specifically gender issues. And that role hadn't existed before. So I became the first ever gender editor there, which I did for a couple of years. And now I'm in more of a flexible, can write what I want and don't have to manage people type role. But that's my backstory. And I started teaching journalism students a couple of years ago. And it was really an interesting challenge to actually put into words how you do the thing, how you create an effective narrative, like what the structure of that is. You know, sometimes I will get a piece from a student that just like isn't doing it. Like it's not grabbing me. It's not bringing me in. I can't relate to the characters. And I'm thinking like, this just isn't it. But to need to articulate that in a way that's constructive and allows them to improve upon it has been a super interesting challenge, and something that I've never had to do before, because it kind of just comes second nature when you've been doing this for a while.
That's great. So, you know, your work has covered a lot of issues where I think one could say that there are a lot of different perspectives, or maybe even, you know, competing perspectives. And how do you think about the sort of role of journalists in covering stories where there are competing perspectives? You know, what is the responsibility of journalism, and also like how do you think about what is truth, or like what is the real story when there are different people in a situation who have, like, you know, in some cases like completely diverging versions or explanations of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, what Rachel said about how a narrative is not just information, but a structure of information, really stuck with me, because as a journalist, I'm trying to get to the root of that information. Like I am trying to find out what the truth to any story may be. But like you said, sometimes there are multiple truths. And that's a tricky thing to say these days, because there's so much misinformation happening. There is so much that is being presented as untruthful that is absolutely wild and batshit. And so we need to be really, really careful about that. But when you're talking about multiple people who've experienced an event, say, they may have very different experiences of that same event. And so you are trying to get to the heart of what occurred through facts. And then you are trying to ask yourself, what is the most compelling way to present these facts? Because so much of our job, and my job, is thinking about how I can reframe a story, or how I can tell a story so that it will stick with people. And it's often really hard to know how to do that and what will stick. And especially today, I mean, I think that this has changed over time. It used to be that there was a few major publications, and when you put a story out, that was the only place a person could get a story. And so that narrative maybe became the truth, or the primary dominant narrative. But today, when there are competing narratives on almost every subject, even really basic things that we thought we knew, even things absolutely rooted in fact, you are competing all the time to present something in a way that people will interpret and remember.
Yeah, it sounds really challenging, and I'm curious how both how, you know, newsrooms and news organizations are thinking about, you know, getting stories to stick, and that really depends on audiences as well, right? And so especially in the digital age, where, you know, there are multiple audiences, multiple channels for reaching readers, you know, how do you think about the sort of intersection between, wanting to create compelling stories that people will read and benefit from, and thinking about trying to reach a more narrow versus a more broad audience? Because I can imagine that those different concerns could potentially butt up against one another.
Well, I think, for journalists, we are always trying to reach the most amount of people. So audiences are segmented, and sometimes you may promote a story in different ways to try to reach different audiences and go to where those audiences are, or where they hang out on the internet or whatever else. But you always want to have the biggest impact and reach the most number of people with your stories. So maybe that almost makes it simpler in some ways, because you're trying to figure out the way to present the information that will reach as many people as you possibly can. And so a lot of my job is thinking about, like, okay, I want to do this story about teen girls' mental health. What is the most effective way to tell that story? Is it like a long through written narrative? That's the traditional way of doing it, but is there something more interesting we could do, or we have the girls tell their stories themselves, or is there a use of audio? Is there a video? I'm working on something like this right now, and I have these 13-year-old girls keeping audio diaries that they send me every week. And, I don't know yet how this story will ultimately be conveyed and delivered, and I probably won't know that for a few months, but we're collecting media from them in a variety of different ways so that we can ultimately, dissect all of it and figure out what is the most compelling way to share their stories.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm wondering also, when you are identifying what stories to write about in the first place, like how does that process work? And to what extent is this process of identifying narratives out in the world, is that coming from sort of a bottom-up data-driven way, or is it more top-down, if that distinction makes sense?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Some combination. It depends. Like, I'm typically trying to tell stories that haven't been told before. And that's something that I've been drawn to throughout my career. So whether it's like an investigative piece, exposing a thing that nobody knew was occurring, or looking at narratives that were covered one way in the past and trying to reframe those narratives for the present day. I like looking at and uncovering these kind of overlooked stories. So sometimes I'll see a data point, with the teen girls story, the data point was, okay, 13 is the age at which everyone can join social media. We know that is also the age at which self-esteem really drops for girls 3 times more rapidly than boys. So is there some way we could combine those things, or to get at what is actually going on there? And so it was a data point that led me to this, but now we're, finding girls to participate. In other cases, I feel like we are talking in the culture right now more about narratives than we ever have been. Like, even some of the terminology is something that people publicly use, reframing of narratives, looking in retrospect at past narratives and understanding them in a new way. This is the kind of stuff that's in the culture, in the zeitgeist, I guess. And I think part of that is a lot of journalists over the past few years have taken some of these stories from the semi-recent past, whether it's like pop stars from the 1990s or Monica Lewinsky, or more recently Pamela Anderson, and said, wait, like, actually that was really fucked up how their story was conveyed. And these are things that, like, I lived through at the time, and once I reached a certain age, could kind of reflect back on and be like, that was so strange and antiquated the way that was presented in the media. So is there a capacity for me to go back and retell that narrative? And so some of my more recent work has really focused on that.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think it touches on a lot of the discussions we've been having in this workshop around epistemic injustice and the idea that, if you are from an identity group that's historically marginalized, your testimony doesn't count as much. And maybe Judy has some thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, I think that's your last point is really related to the question we're thinking about. Do you think there are particular ways that different kinds of people, especially since you have worked so much on gender stories, like women versus men, have to present their stories in order to be taken seriously or for it to like stick or really be believed? Have you seen like examples of that
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I'm typically thinking, as a journalist, I'm typically thinking of it as, how can I present this person's story in a way that will be the most compelling? So a lot of the kind of narrative work is falling to me. But I do think that, obviously, historically, people from marginalized groups have not been listened to, have not been believed. And I think that there's a correction happening right now. But I do think about that. I think about what is the most responsible way to present this story. What is there's like this, I'm sure you all know, there's this like big tension between journalists and academics, because we're like, we need to leave out some of the information in order to present the best, stickiest, most compelling narrative. And we know that we're not getting every detail in there, but like, this is the way it has to be. And I think it's a healthy tension to be like, okay, but you're leaving out some of the nuance. Like, how can we get to a happy medium? And so I think about that a lot when I'm presenting characters. What is the most compelling information? Because I can't fit it all in a 2,000-word piece.
I had another question also following up to what you were saying about, like, I think it's so interesting that you're saying like maybe journalists are a little more aware of narratives than you're talking about it more than before. Does that in a way make it harder and feel like you have to like actually explicitly like compete other narratives from other places, because presumably like other people who want to put out other narratives also are more aware that there are competing, like, is the awareness making it like harder or easier to actually, I mean,
I guess I try not to get too in my head about other narratives as I'm working on a story. Like, I just want to present the best story. I can't worry about the other narratives that are out there, but I'm also cognizant that in some situations, and depending on the subject matter, there will probably be some misinformation, or when the story comes out, there will be like blatant lies published by other publications that will be spread on the internet. And so there will be this sort of battle for the truth. And I think journalists are thinking about that a lot more today, and especially those who are covering, national security and less cultural issues like I am. But for sure that's happening. And I do think, I think the conversation around narratives is not just happening among journalists, it's just happening among the public. Like, my students sort of have this understanding about the complexity of narratives and the way that stories have been told historically that like I just didn't when I was their age. And I don't think most people were talking about even like 5-10 years ago.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We're going to now open it to questions from the audience that can be directed towards Jessica or Rachel or both. And we did have one question earlier, I think, in Rachel's presentation. So we can start with Talia if you still have a question, but also feel free to raise your hand and we will go through.
Hi, yeah, this is for Rachel. It's a really cool talk. I was interested in, okay, so the idea that maybe just narratives are something that's easy to grasp and more intelligible, like there seems to still be something distinct about narratives. Like, no teacher is going to teach Pythagorean theorem using a narrative, but like, and narratives seem to have characters and plots and conflicts that get resolved that Pythagorean theorem doesn't. So, and some of the exceptionalist views seem to be capturing some of that uniqueness. So what do you make of that?
Great question. So I would say it's important to distinguish between two different theses. So like thesis one would just be something like, there's nothing distinctive about narratives compared to things that are not narratives. And yeah, I think the sorts of remarks you just made suggest that that would be like a false claim. You know, it might be really hard to come up with any sort of list of necessary and sufficient conditions for, you know, what distinguishes a narrative from a non-narrative. But certainly it seems like there are features of narratives that at least broadly distinguish them from other ways of packaging information. So the anti-exceptionalist claim that I'm interested in is not the claim that there's nothing distinctive about narratives or there's nothing that distinguishes narratives from non-narratives. Rather, it's a much narrower claim, which says when we focus on the way in which narratives engender or impart understanding, the distinctively narrative features of the text are not doing any special work, which is compatible with recognizing that there are things that are distinctive about narrative. It's just saying those distinctively narrative things aren't doing any specific work when it comes to the conferral of intelligibility.
Cool, thank you.
Next question from Amy.
Hi, thank you both so much for really interesting talks. This question is for Dr. Fraser. So my background is I'm a social cognitive psychologist, and I do work on counterfactual thinking, among other things. And in my field, we tend to think about counterfactuals as conveying causal links. So if I say, if I had taken the train to the airport instead of a taxi, I wouldn't have missed the flight, right? That's saying that the way I got to the airport is why I was late and not what time I woke up or the security lines or whatnot. One of the points that you made seemed to be that grasp is actually what's enabling people to answer counterfactual questions. So you had made a point that grasp is letting you answer questions like, what if such and such had been different? So I'm just really curious about kind of what you would see as a causal triangle between grasp and counterfactuals and these kind of causal understandings. Is it that sort of grasp is what's coming first and producing both of these in your viewpoint, or how do you see them being related?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I think there's probably a fair, and obviously there's not going to be like total overlap, but from what you said, it sounds like there's a fair amount of overlap between the ways in which you're thinking about the connections between causation and counterfactuals and the way philosophers are going to think about them. So there's quite a lot of common ground to sort of kick us off there, which is always nice. So you're quite right that a lot of people are thinking, you know, that either grasp is partly constituted by this ability to answer like counterfactual questions, or at least the ability to answer, the ability to answer such questions might not itself be constitutive of grasp, but it might be sort of a good heuristic for detecting the presence of grasp. It might be a kind of signal or indication of the presence of grasp. So I think that basically this is gonna, I think in many ways be a very unsatisfactory question, because I think that just different philosophers who have sort of different accounts of grasp and thus different accounts of the nature of understanding are probably going to like fill in these connections in very slightly different ways, right? Because they're responding, or their theories are kind of tailored to handle sort of slightly different concerns. But let me think for just a second and see if there's anything sort of more substantive I can say that speaks to your question.
That's great.
Yeah, just take a minute.
I was going to say, I'll also drop my email in the chat if you want to take this offline as well. Thank you so much.
Great.
Great.
Thank you.
We're almost out of time, so I want to give Tanya a chance to ask a question.
Well, thank you both for really fascinating talks. So I have a question for Jessica, inspired by the kinds of issues that Rachel was talking about. And in particular, what I'm thinking about is to what extent the process of constructing a narrative or trying to put something in narrative form might shape our understanding. So I was curious how that comes up in your writing process, Jessica. So is it the case that you find that in the course of thinking about how you're going to tell the most compelling story, you feel like your own take on the issue changes or your own understanding of that person's perspective changes? I would just love to hear what that's like from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. And I was writing a note to myself saying like, I need to know from you all what is the most effective way to form a narrative, like psychologically speaking, what is the most effective way to form a narrative? Because that would be super useful information. I am not thinking about how it will stick as I'm doing it. I am just trying to put together the most compelling details of a story. And I'm sure it's so interesting to think about, because I'm sure there are all sorts of my own biases that go into this, or like what I think is compelling, or what I think is, I don't know, outlandish or dramatic and will get people's attention. Like all of the ways that we interpret details of a story are coming into play as I'm putting together in like a architecture. The words, you want to have sort of an arc, you want to have tension, you want to build to something. And those are things that I have learned over time, but I tend to like do in the writing rather than think about what they are building up to. So I now am inspired to like put together some sort of architecture for how it actually works in the mind, because I'm very curious how that could be more effective. I forget if I'm answering the second part of the question now.
I think the second part of the question was whether your views have changed about a story in the process of writing it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're sort of like pulling the thread and unraveling details and trying to get to the truth. And so almost every single time I go in with some sort of thesis in the back of my mind, or what I think happened. And then I think the best stories are when I leave with a completely different perspective on it.
Amazing. Thank you so much to our audience and also our two speakers. We are, my clock says 11:59, so I think we will wrap up here. This was such an enriching session, and I have a lot of questions I'm going to think more about after this, the connection between the ideas and the thoughts raised here is really, really rich. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time.